Welcome to the Clear to Send podcast, a podcast about wireless engineering, where we educate you on Wi-Fi technology, talk about design tips, troubleshooting, interviews, and the tools. Here are your hosts, Rowell and François.
Hi guys, welcome to a brand new episode of the Clear to Send podcast. This is François and I'm here with Rowell. Hey Rowell, how are you?
Hey, good morning. How are you doing?
Very good, very good. So today we're going to talk about APIs. As we slowly get into programming and automation and all, API is a key part of that. And we just wanted to introduce the concept and then talk about the little experience that we have with APIs.
Yeah, sounds good.
So APIs it's a very exciting tool that we can use to pretty much interact between different pieces of software, right? It's a communication protocol to interface between different software. So in the world of networking or in the world of Wi-Fi, you could think of it as a way to communicate between your controller and then a script, for instance, so a piece of code that you write. And so instead of having user and admin going and clicking on an AP name and renaming an AP, you could actually have a script that would just do that and then interact with the controller using an API, which is like a specific language that will just make everything happen.
Yeah.
So API stands for Application Programming Interface. Sorry. Yeah. And in this episode, we wanted to, introduce a little bit how it works, and then tell you guys, why you would want to use APIs, some of the use cases, and then we'll tell you how you can, use them or how you can, test them and get started on your own if you do have the equipment that support them.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, because you do need to have the hardware. Or if you have access to it in order to leverage the APIs, because you do need to log in somehow, a token to access this data. So we'll get into that as well.
And APIs, I think it's important to mention that it's not only limited to the networking world. It's you find APIs everywhere in pretty much all the the developing world. So you could have, for instance, the Google Map API that allows you to interact with Google Map, right? Or you could have different type of APIs out there that will allow you to interact with different software. Here we'll focus on Wi-Fi. We'll talk about Mist and Meraki and all. But API is more like it's something that's more general and used everywhere in the developing world.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny you bring up Google Maps, François, because if you can, you would be able to tie that in somehow with Wi-Fi, right? Let's say you have a distributed environment and you want to build out location of where your sites are. You could pull in a Google Map API and put up a map on a dashboard showing where your sites are.
Yeah, and that's pretty. That's what I was going to say. That's probably what they do on the dashboards, right? And let's say on the Meraki dashboard, they probably have that tied to the Google Map API. So instead of having you recoding the whole map system, you could just call the Google API to the Google API map to send you the map.
So that's a pretty good way to at least look at it from that standpoint. But some of the other use cases, like why you would want to use an API, for many of us, that reason is to do a custom dashboard. I think that's a very familiar a very familiar way of using APIs. And we've seen this before, especially at Cisco Live, where they show us a lot of client statistics, and that's all created using APIs and scripts.
Yeah, exactly. So you create a script that would, send API requests to the controller and retrieve some data on a regular basis. And then you get all that data and then you can graph it. You can put it in a tab and you can display it on a simple web dashboard that will just pretty much do all the requests for you in the background. So you don't have to do anything. It just updates the data as you go, and you can. So the advantage of it is it's you can create the dashboard that you want, right?
Yeah.
So let's say you support an event, you're going to want to see a specific set of data. If you're supporting a hospital, you might not want to see the exact same set of data, so you would want maybe to adjust the dashboard to see exactly what you want to see, and so on and so forth, right? And usually solutions like Cisco Prime and so on, they're like super, heavy, and maybe they're not showing you exactly what you want to see, or if you want to find out and configure it to show exactly what you want to see, it's going to take you 2 hours of researching information. You could just create your own dashboard that go and retrieve that specific information and show it to you in a very simple dashboard. And that's a very, really good use case, I guess, for the APIs, and they use APIs in the networking world.
Yeah, and Cisco Prime helps us to do that, right? And Cisco Prime itself has its own API, so maybe there is a dashboard that you don't have from Cisco Prime that you want to create yourself, so you can actually leverage Cisco Prime to get that for you. And then Cisco Prime also helps automate a lot of the configuration. I mean, you could also start using your own scripts to do configuration without using Cisco Prime. So there's a lot of different ways you can go looking at it, because automation is a big piece, especially when it comes to installs, right? So if you're rolling out a ton of sites and you're a one-man show, or maybe you're a small team, then you're going to want to automate that process, right? And use the variables that will help speed up that installation. And so if you have a site, you could deploy X number of APs per site, and you could quickly roll out that configuration and they'll be ready to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And usually the way we do that is we have like a Excel sheet with the name of the new sites, right? And then you can just have a script that will read that file and then create, using API calls, create those new sites onto your system. Mm-hmm. And so all you have to do is define those sites, right? Maybe the address, maybe different details related, description related to those sites, and you can push all that information at once to the dashboard instead of doing, next, and entering the data manually. A good point about automation too is that it minimizes human errors. Yeah. Right. You just have to be careful, because if you make a mistake, you can automate the mistake as well.
Yeah. which is a good segue into testing, because you could do some a certain level of validation testing, and I don't mean like Wi-Fi validation testing. You could include some scripts to test your configuration out, right? And if there's certain expectations to a deployment, you could script something to test that for you, to validate that, okay, if I have X number of APs installed at this site, I should be able to see them on a switch, for example. So you know which switch ports they're connected to. You do know that these specific APs should be coming from this site and subnet. You can do tests like that, right, to validate that they were installed in the right site. Some people are creating robots to do some of the Wi-Fi validation for them, and that would be interesting to try to use APIs to put them on a map. Mm-hmm. And you could see, all right, the right AP did get put in its location that I designated for in the map, which we did see, François, from WLPC Prague, where Mike Albano did a deep dive for us.
Yeah, he was using the Google Slide API to retrieve that information, which was pretty, yeah. And also thinking about the robot. If the robot is connected to the internet, you could have. It would be nice if they could send the data directly, and then you could have a dashboard where you see the robot in real time, and you can see the signal it gets in real time.
It doesn't sound too far off if you're using the Mist API, since they have the location on there.
Yeah. Well, you're going to get to work after this recording? Yeah, so a whole bunch of use cases using API. And the beauty of it is, pretty much sky is the limit. Like if you can think about something, you can pretty much try to see if you can do it with the set of data you have, and if you can do it, you can just implement it and have it working. So that's a really nice thing about API as well, right? You can just create your own thing. I guess the only limitation is how comfortable you are with programming, but everything, you can learn everything, so you can probably learn that as well.
Yeah, so we won't get too far into programming here. We're just going to introduce the APIs and how to access them and the common things you should look at. So I guess we should now move on to how do you get access to an API?
Yeah, so APIs are usually defined by the vendors, right? So they would have a documentation on their website, and they will tell you, if you want to get a list of all the access points, you need to use that set of values, or you need to use that specific URL. And then you will just reuse that to make your API call and then retrieve that list of AP. And the API we use in the network space today are they call Restful APIs. And Restful, it stands for Representational State Transfer. And it's a framework, it's an API framework that's very popular for web services. And it's built on HTTP. And so whenever you make a request, you'll see that it will look like a URL. And whenever you get a response, you'll see that you will get the response and status and error codes of a typical HTTP transfer, right? So if you're familiar with HTTP, it will look very familiar to you. To build your API call, you will pretty much build an URL, and to understand the responses, you will read your status and the codes back from the from the system you're calling. So to build that URL, you will need to go back to the vendor documentations and in order to understand which variable you need to set, which specific path you need to set, and then you pretty much build your URL with that. And then to test if everything is working well, the most popular application that we use is called Postman. Yep. And Postman is a software that you can just download, install for free on your computer. And then with that software, you can test your API calls.
Yeah, it'll... So actually, to go back to the URL, it's very different for every vendor, right? So, for example, Mist will start off with https api.mist.com/API. And then, if there's version 1, version 2, and then you could define different variables there for what you want to get. And it's the same for something like Meraki, where you're going to there's just more like a dashboard API. So you're going to hit dashboard.meraki.com. So it just depends which vendor you're using. You'll see like a /API at the end. And then in order to get any information, you do need that to create your token, which will be the authentication to the API, which the token you keep to yourself. So you don't want to share that with other people, because then that gives them the ability to query the API with your credentials. And then the way I've used Postman is what's really neat is you could organize everything in your workspace where you have different environments. So I have access to different environments, and I have different variables per environment, right? So the site ID is an example, or organization ID, which you'll do your queries specific to that environment. And then what's really neat is in Postman, there's collections where I have a collection for Meraki specific API calls, and then you can have a different collection for Mist specific API calls. And so that way it makes it a little bit easier when you're doing your queries, because then you'll see the output within Postman. And then let's say you want to create a script based on that output, right? Because you're doing some testing. There is a way to actually see the code in which it made that request to the API, and then you could start from there, right? So you can see what that Python request looks like, and then start building out your script.
Yeah, and you can also analyze the response that you get, right?
Yeah, the responses are going to be very important. But I guess before we get to responses, we did mention about like getting that information. That is what we call an API call. in order to get that information. But there are different kinds of API calls, right, François?
Yeah, so you have that, that's what they call the methods. So you have, four, I guess, that we use the most often. And these would have to be defined by the vendor you're using, right? So you need to make sure that, if you're using Mist or if you're using Meraki, they have those defined in the APIs. But the most popular are the get, put, post, and delete, right? So if you're familiar with HTTP, it's going to look familiar to you. The get method is used to, request some information, right? So the gets will return the value of a resource or list of resources you're asking for. So you could say, okay, can I please get the list of online APs? And then you will get all the APs for a specific site, and then you will get the list of all the APs, and then you're probably going to get a little bit more. They're going to give you the details, of the APs, the MAC addresses and so on. So that's for the get. So the get is used to retrieve information from your system, right? The second one is put. So put is used to add a new resource. So if you have, let's say, if you want to create a site, you would just send a put request, and then you'll specify, the name of the site and everything. And that will add, a new site on your system, your remote system, to the put.
Yeah. And this is a easy way to say create 50 sites. You have 50 new sites. You don't want to do it manually in the dashboard, clicking and naming everything. You could create a script that just does it for you instead of using the dashboard.
Exactly. And then the third one is post. So post will update a resource. So let's say you have an access point that you want to rename. You can do a get and retrieve the information related to that access point, and then you do a post to update, let's say, the name, and then you can just the name will be updated on your system.
Yeah, you make it sound so easy, François.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if it's that easy. But yeah, that's the idea. And then the last one is delete. So this one will just remove a resource. So if you want to delete a user, let's say, you can just delete Rowell MAC address, and then he's not on the network.
Then
anymore.
I'm not on Wi-Fi anymore. Boo-hoo.
You switch to 5G, I guess. Yeah, so those are the methods. So every time you send them a request, you will get a response, right? So let's say you were configuring a Mist something on the Mist dashboard. You send a request, and then you will get a response, right? And these responses are pretty much HTTP codes. So if everything goes well, you will get a 200. 200 means everything went well. If you did a get and you receive a 200, you should also receive the results of your request. So if you say, can you send me the list of APs? You should say, you should get a 200 code, and then you should see the list of your APs. And typically those are formatted into a JSON format because it's just easier to process afterwards in your script.
Yeah. Yeah. Mist will use JSON. I think the same with Meraki. It depends on the API, right? There's some vendors that will use XML, for example. Yeah. So it just depends on whose API you're using and how you're going to get that data. It could be YAML, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and those type of format can be specified as well in the headers, right? So just like in HTTP, you have headers. You mentioned the token that you specify in the header. The content type is also something you can specify in the header, right? So you can say content type application JSON, so which means that you will expect to get some JSON back. Or if you put some data, you're telling the system that you're putting some JSON data.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing to note, you're going to come across this with responses, is when you form a bad request, you'll get the error codes, either like a 400 error code, which is actually a bad request, or maybe there's something that was not found in the API. So that's going to be a 404, kind of like a 404 page when you're requesting a website and it doesn't exist, or the website could not find your request. those are going to be common as you're playing around with the API. I've done it a couple times where I just fat finger the URL, for example, and I will get a 404. So if you're not following the exact syntax of that URL, then it's not going to give you the actual answer, but you have to look at the status code and the error in order to troubleshoot.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll put some status code in the show notes, but you have, the regular or the usual one, 400 bad request, or you could have 401 unauthorized. Maybe you have the wrong token, 500 internal server error, and so on. So you have the typical HTTP code. So you have an idea of what you did wrong. You can double check, like you said, your URL, make sure everything is fine. And this will be very important because, like you said, when you write a script, let's say, and you put an API call inside a script, you might not be right the first time around. And if something is wrong, you're gonna have to be able to debug where the mistake was made, and this will help you to do so. And Postman will also help you to do so. So you could test your API in Postman and see if it works. If it works in Postman, that's a good sign. Then you go back to your script, try to see maybe something else is wrong. Maybe, the string that you're using is not exactly the same. Maybe you have a space or you're missing a comma, something like that. And you can go back and forth and fix your issue.
Yeah. And some of the things that you should consider, and François ran into this, is the limitation you may have when making calls with the API, right? So, François, you ran into an issue when you're actually using Google Sheets as an API, right? So, why would François want to use Google Sheets? Well, maybe you want to grab a list of APs and MAC addresses and put them into an Excel sheet or a Google Sheet to share with maybe your installer, for example, or with somebody, and then you're making too many calls.
Yep.
And there is a limitation with API where they tell you, here's how many calls you can make per hour, for example, right? And so you want to be able to pay attention to that.
Yeah, exactly. You could probably pay and get more. I don't know, right? But by default, you have some limitations. So the one I run into for Google Sheet, I think it was 100 calls per 90 seconds, something like that. And what I was doing I was creating one line per AP, and I had over 200 APs. So at one point, my script stopped, and then I got a message from the Google API telling me that I reached the limit. And
Meraki's done a presentation, I think, at DevNet Create, where they talk about how many API calls are made, and this is really to limit also the resources on the vendor side, because Meraki, I think, was making. I can't remember. I'll have to look it up, but I know it was a large number of calls per hour, just in general, over across the whole organization and everyone who uses Meraki. So there are a lot of people using the API, and it makes me wonder how that stacks up to their cloud infrastructure, right?
Yeah, because if you think about it, when you make an API call, let's say to the Meraki dashboard, you're not paying anything, but Meraki is probably hosting the dashboard on something like AWS, and they have to pay for that traffic, right? So if they have a lot of traffic, they're gonna pay the bill at the end of the month for their cloud services will be higher. So the limitation for Meraki is 5 calls per second, and the limitation for Mist is 5,000 calls per hour. So you do the math.
It's a lot of calls, basically. So, it is possible to do a lot of calls, right? Depending on how you're creating your script, because I wasn't even creating a script. I was just querying. What was I doing? I was trying to get the RSSI of my device, but I kept hitting send, like in Postman. So can you imagine if you were gathering data, and let's say you wanted something more aggressive than an SNMP poll, right? You wanted something faster than every 5 minutes. So if you're doing a call for one client very at a short interval, can you imagine doing that for thousands of devices as you're trying to query that often? 1,000 devices per every 3 minutes, or even even shorter than that, you'll hit that limitation pretty quickly.
Yeah. It sounds like a lot, but when you start doing some work, you'll see that, oh shoot, I just did a loop on 100 devices, and that's gone, right? That's all the API calls you make, right? So, but that loop could be on 2,000 devices, right? So
right, and it's not always just one specific metric of a device. You could be getting a number of different metrics.
Yeah, exactly. So those limitations will be something to consider if you do, if you get into writing a big script or automate a big deployment, you might have to put some, you could split your code into different scripts that you run at different times, or you could add sleeps in your script so the script pretty much wait, for some seconds before executing, other piece of codes. But so that's something to consider.
Yeah, it's all part of the learning experience, and I'll say I'm not even that far advanced, but last night was able to create a simple script where I just wanted to gather all the sites that my account has access to, and then I listed the SSIDs in that site, and was able to create a simple script. All it was naming the SSIDs, if they were enabled, and what VLAN they were. And that took me under 30 minutes, I think. I was using Postman to test it, and then had to structure the Python script to dump out the data that I wanted in an easy format to read. So I think I'll share what I created in the show notes. Maybe, François, you can share yours, because we actually came up with very similar scripts, but it was just they were written differently.
Yeah,
and that just shows how you can do things differently in scripting, because I posted my script and then you posted yours, and without any realization that either of us were doing the same thing.
Yeah, it was funny. So I woke up this morning and I didn't see your script, and I started to work. So I published my first official YouTube video, I guess we can call it that way, on my company YouTube channel, and I was explaining how you can get started with Postman and setting up Postman to your first missed API call. And then I was in that video, I was just retrieving the list of access points that I have at my house. And I was doing that using Postman. And my next step would be, to do the exact same thing, but using a script instead, right? So writing a script that would just, do the API call for me, and then retrieve the data back from the Mist dashboard, and then print it out for me. So I did that this morning, and then when I went back to the Slack group we have for the Clearson podcast, I saw Rowell's code. I was like, man, I could have just reused your code, but I guess it's a good way to learn about it. And then we just did things a little bit differently. It's very similar though. We use the same modules.
It's very similar, and it just shows that how we're able to learn it, and you could do the same thing, right? It's just a matter of trying it out. You could I think you can get access to the Meraki dashboard pretty easily using the API. I think you just need to create an account, and then for Meraki, it's basically enabling the API for the organization. So you do have to do that first with Meraki. Is if you have access to multiple organizations in the organizational settings, you have to enable API. And I think for Mist, that's just enabled by default.
Yeah, it's enabled by default. You just have to log in with your account, and then you navigate to the Mist API documentation, and you can start from there.
Because they are an API first company.
Yeah, everything is API developed in the API first, and after that they will include it in the dashboard. Yep. So you could actually do stuff using the API that you cannot do on the dashboard.
There you go.
And something I wanted to mention is, if you want to write a Python script to make API calls, there is a Python module called request that you can use with Python 3, and it will ease the process for you. one thing I run into, I don't know if you run into that, Rowell, but on macOS, request wasn't installed by default.
I had to install it.
Yeah, so what I did is I actually created a virtual environment, and I installed in my virtual environment. I don't know if, you could probably do it on macOS, but
yeah, you can. Mine is just installed on my Mac. I don't use virtual environments that often, and we should probably talk about that in a future episode. But the way you're doing it is a good way to do it, which is doing all your testing in a virtual environment so you don't
mess up
your actual environment.
Yeah. So I did that.
But I just like to live dangerously.
Yeah. Yeah, so I created a virtual environment, I installed requests, and then I was able to just use it. And then I guess you can go to the show notes and look at the code, and it will make sense to you guys.
Yeah, we have import statements at the top, which is importing a module that will be required to be used when making these API calls.
All right. I think that's pretty much it. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, we just want.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say the more you try this out, the more ideas you'll get in your head. I mean, I have a lot of ideas about when I start doing this. It's just a matter of learning Python, for example. I'm sticking to Python for the most part, and then structuring a lot of this information that you can get. Getting the information is the easiest part. Because it's just a GET request, right? You could use something like curl, for example, command line to get this as well. But once you have the data, you have to format that data in a way, like you have to parse it and put it together in a way that makes sense for you. And so far, for me, it's just creating the right loops and then structuring it in a way where you create a table, or in the future you start creating actual dashboards.
Yeah,
but it's fun, I think, and like being able to do this.
And then if you could also use Postman to write scripts. I've never done it, but I've heard about it. So if you're not too comfortable by writing code and all of that, you could actually leverage Postman, which is more like a GUI type of interface, and you can use that to define your variables, define your keys, and then do your API calls and write some scripts. There's if you have Meraki, they have some pretty good Postman documentation. They actually, I think they have a Postman collection that you could download, and then reuse.
Yeah, actually, that's the best way to get started, because Meraki has a sandbox, and all you need is an account. So they have also these labs on DevNet. I think it's like devnet.cisco.com. And so when you get access to the Meraki sandbox, you could use their API collection. And what you're doing is going to query, I think, their environment at their HQ. So you can see all the devices, all the hardware, the sandbox. You could also put stuff there. So you can create a site or an organization, and then you could play around with those APIs. So you can do that in Postman and then see what that looks like with the information you get, and then you could create a script using the sandbox. So that's the best way to get started, because they have all that already built out, the clients and the hardware. That way you're not, if you're like me, I have one missed AP with just the clients I have at home and one organization. So it's not very, it's not advanced, right? I don't have a lot going on, but with the Meraki dashboard and the sandbox, you could play around with that.
And then, so we'll put all the link in the description as well, or in the show notes, so you can visit those. And then if you don't have Mist or Meraki, you can just look at the vendor you have and see if they have any APIs available. And then if they do, you can try to see on their documentation how you can get started. Usually they have pretty good documentation that helps you to get started. Right.
Yep, for sure.
And if you have other vendors, just share that with us, and then let us know if they have APIs. We'd love to know. We looked at Unify, and they have an API as well. So that'd be interesting to know.
So there's a lot to get started with.
All right. So Thank you guys for listening. We'll put all the details in the show notes. That would be cleartosend.net/208, and then you'll be able to pretty much get your first API call started. Hopefully, share that with us.
Yes, looks good. Looking forward to seeing what you guys can create.
Thank you guys. Have a good week, and we'll tune in next week in a new episode. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.